Longings of the world in every heart, callings on a life to find its part, inklings deep within, praying for a sign, hoping for the day when we will find a city on a hill, a dream beyond the night, a fountain that will fill, a light that's shining bright to illumine every sphere, to raise our sights above, to make the pathway clear, to lead us in God's love. Saying yes to life and each new day. Taking each new step in mercy's way. Healing who we are. Setting spirits free. Knowing that we all are called to be a city on a hill, a dream beyond the night, a fountain that will fill, a light that's shining bright to illumine every sphere, to raise our sights above, to make the pathway clear, to lead us in God's love. Holding holy gifts with grateful hands, blessing hallowed lives with sacred plans, greeting greater truth, waking as we go, walking in a world that needs to know a city on the hill, a dream beyond the night, a fountain that will fill, a light that's shining bright to illumine every sphere, to raise our sights above, to make the pathway clear, to lead us in God's love. A city on a hill, a dream beyond the night, a fountain that will fill, a light that's shining bright to illumine every sphere, to raise our sights above, to make the pathway clear, to lead us in God's love. Longings of the world in every heart, callings on a life to find its part, inklings deep within, praying for a sign, hoping for the day when we will find a city on a hill, a dream beyond the night, a fountain that will fill, a light that's shining bright to illumine every sphere, to raise our sights up, to make the pathway clear, to lead us in God's love. saying yes to life and each new day. Taking each new step in mercy's way. Healing who we are, setting spirits free, knowing that we all are called to be a city on a hill, a dream beyond the night, a fountain that will fill, a light that's shining bright to illumine every sphere.
All for being here today. I so appreciate it. I know that my education and prevention team, in combination with our chaplain Teresa, have worked so hard to bring this panel to you today, and I'm really excited to get to see it. This is the first time that I've been able to actually sit in on one of our community roundtables, so I'm super excited to be a part of it as well. So you saw the PowerPoint, you saw a little bit about Foothills and about what we do. Did anybody have any questions before we jumped into that? Okay, great. I would like to say that you saw the slide about Roma. I'm very partial to her. She is mine. Well, I'm hers. I'm her handler. She and I came from the solicitor's office together back in January of 2020, and we've been a working team since 2015. So we've been together for a minute now. I like to mention her specifically on today because today is her birthday. She's 8 today. So as soon as our community education roundtable is over, we're going to go to Chick-fil-A and celebrate like we do every year. But about the roundtable, I just wanted to thank our panelists, Christina, Eric, Lauren, and Jocelyn. Thank you so much for being with us, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your outlooks and your positions on any number of things. We're so excited to have all of you here today and participating and sharing with us. This is kind of a difficult topic sometimes. We are a diverse organization. This is a diverse panel, and we serve a diverse group of people. The whole point of Foothills is that we are here to serve anyone and everyone who needs us, and we want to make sure that everyone feels at home in our organization. And that's why it's so important for all of us and for all of you to hear from different perspectives and different points of view. I'm very excited to see multiple members of my staff and a board member of mine on the call today who also helped putting together this panel. Thank you, Lucila. Like I said, it's super important that we continue to learn from each other and that we take that information and we put it back into our survivors, because we do serve a large group of people, a large and diverse group of people. Everyone reacts to trauma differently. All trauma survivors are different. Every type of trauma is different. And so to our panelists, thank you for helping us really understand that we need to respond differently and uniquely to each and every survivor. So you may hear things today that you don't agree with necessarily. You may hear things today that you agree very strongly with, and that's great too. But I ask that you just be respectful in your discourse and that you listen with an open mind and an open heart, because that's what we do at Foothills. So thank you all so much for being here, for participating, and for sharing, and I hope you enjoy it so much.
Thank you, Chelsea. My name is Teresa, and I am the chaplain here at Foothills Alliance. My job is providing spiritual care to the clients as well as the loved ones of all of those who are coming to Foothills Alliance. We serve Oconee and Anderson County. For myself, I define spirituality as meaning making. And so you can think that gives sacred space to all people because we're all very different. So depending on your context and also where you are historically, your spirituality will look very different depending on where you are and what you hold sacred in your body. With that being said, at Foothills Alliance, we recognize that this is a much needed conversation to talk about trauma and spirituality, but it is also one that's difficult to have. And so we want all of you here to know that this is safe space for you. And in the comment section, we will have a link to a chat room. So if you are listening in on this and you feel like you need some extra support or you're feeling triggered and you just need somebody to talk to, we have professionals who are in that chat room who are going to be offering support for you. So please, we want you to take care of yourself. And if you need somebody to listen to your story, please do not hesitate to see our chat room. It's 100% anonymous. So, but on top of that, we will have our question section for our panelists at the very end. So please stick around for that. But if you're putting questions into the chat, know that we're not ignoring you. That will be sent at the very end. Okay. So with all of that, welcome panelists. We're so excited for you all to be here. We are going to start with our first question. And that is, please introduce yourself, share your pronouns if you feel comfortable, and tell us a little bit about your place of work.
Hi, my name is Christina Branham Martin, and I'm the interim minister at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Clemson. And I am pleased to be here. Part of my place of work is providing pastoral care and leadership to a congregation with diverse religious beliefs. And I think that really ties into the work we're doing today together.
My name is Eric Coleman. My pronouns are he, him, and my place of work currently is in transition. I've been a clinical chaplain at a level 1 trauma for the last year and a half, and we'll be moving to the VA in Johnson City, Tennessee to do a psychiatric fellowship for the next year. So my work is kind of in the emergency room, ICUs, and just general clinical spaces, and then community support with churches and fellow social workers.
I'm an August graduate of Truett Seminary. I work for myself mostly. I don't know why I'm saying like I don't know what I do. I'm a worship leader. I'm a clinician. I lead workshops, all sorts of things, mostly around Black hymnody, Black sacred music, and those sorts of things. And I'm really glad to be here. My pronouns are she, her.
Morning, y'all. My name's Lauren, pronoun she, her. I work as the operations director for an organization called Q Christian Fellowship. So we create radical belonging and affirmation for LGBTQ plus Christians and allies, specifically within Christian context. So I spend most of my days these days living in spreadsheets and policy land, but I do get to curate theological resources on our end as well for community and support groups for queer individuals. So I'm really glad to be here this morning and think this is a really important topic to talk about.
Thank you.
And I'll just add, I use she, her also. I had put it on my name, so I forgot to say it in my nervousness. Thanks.
Thank you. So we're going to move to our second question, and that is, what are some types of trauma that you are currently providing support for within your organizations?
So in my setting, being in the hospital clinical setting, as you can imagine, kind of the first line things that we see are acute stress and trauma experiences, from the ED, from being in ICU spaces. So there's lots of the acute kind of things that you would imagine in a hospital setting. But there's also a lot of spiritual abuse and spiritual trauma that people carry with them, because they're wounded and they carry these narratives that are been told they're broken or been told that they're not redeemable, and then they end up in a space where they need to lean on a higher power of faith, and they don't really know where to turn. So it's a really unique space to be and to work with. We also right now are seeing a massive amount of vicarious trauma, complicated grief due to COVID. People can't grieve with loved ones who are in the hospital. We're having to delay funerals because of the gathering capacity requirements. So anything you can imagine in the grief world is kind of showing up in full magnitude. On top of just the ethical dilemmas that hospitals are now having to process through. I'm sure you've seen stories of health systems having to ration care. Most every system is having those discussions, and thankfully chaplains are being invited in that space as a ethics consultant role to help our physicians and our nurses and our families through these difficult waters.
Thank you.
I I worked for Baylor for 2 years. I'll reiterate the question too. The type of trauma that I'm currently providing space for is racial trauma. So I worked for Baylor for 2 years and experienced some really harmful things as a result of being on staff at Baylor, and folks who kind of find themselves beholden to what Christianity is. Not folks, but students who find themselves beholden to what Christianity is, and they kind of made those things loom above me and gave a boundary to what Christianity was. So yeah, I hold space for folks who have experienced or are experiencing racial trauma, mostly gender-based. I'm a womanist, so I'm always championing the Black woman and looking at how the Black woman is treated in organizations and schools and companies and in businesses and so forth. So yeah, I'm holding space for people who have experienced or are experiencing racial trauma.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
We hold space for individuals who are coming from a variety of queer-specific traumatic environments. So queer individuals writ large experience higher levels of trauma than the general population. So best case scenario, we have a lot of community members who are coming in, maybe just looking for additional support, having experienced micro or macro level aggressions as a queer individual. Worst case scenario, we have a lot of people who are coming into our organization having experienced conversion therapy, knowing that it is still categorically legal around religious freedom laws in about 30 different states. So there's a lot of people who are coming into a queer religious space with a lot of spiritual trauma that is the direct result of a spiritual leader. So I think it's about 4 out of 5 individuals who experience conversion therapy or change initiatives will have done so at the hands of a religious leader or a spiritual mentor. So we have a lot of individuals who are working through their spirituality in tandem with their sexual orientation and or gender identity and trying to reconcile the two of them and really ascertain for themselves if Christianity is even really something they want to hold on to, or if it's something that they need to let go of for their own mental well-being. So we facilitate the process in both directions in terms of giving people an area and the resources to work through trauma in a safe, affirming environment, but also giving them the space to really discern for themselves whether or not this spirituality is right for them.
Thank you, Lauren.
So the support that I'm offering at this time within the community in which I serve as a minister for, and also within the community at large within the Clemson area of South Carolina, which I know this panel is including people from all over. But I think what's really important about that is, as I serve people that come to me individually for pastoral care or a way to be a part of the community itself, being in my religious faith, people might come with their own history of whatever religious childhood they had and come forth with a sense of woundedness or a sense of lacking, much like the other panelists talked about, dealing with the trauma that you were told you were not worthy or lovable or redeemable, and being able to provide resources that are about spirituality as a whole, looking at things from an interfaith perspective, that most of the world's religions are based on love and acceptance and seeking to provide community for each other. It seems that we're all trying to do that from our different perspectives. I think what's also really important is that if you look within the roles of many religious leaders at this time, we're also seeking justice and equity in our communities. And it's very hard to do right now when we've got such unrest, not just from COVID, but from the seeking of racial healing with everything that's been going on within community. We are seeing trauma responses not only in the people we're serving one-on-one, but as the collective of the community as a whole. And I think it's because we're just on rocky ground right now of who are we and how can we trust each other in so many different ways. So I see the trauma response come up individually and collectively.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you all for sharing your background and your places that you guys are making the world a better place for all. Moving on to our next question. This is a lengthy question, so if I need to repeat it, don't don't hesitate. I'll repeat it again, okay? But in your work, what are some forms of harmful or limiting spiritual messages that you have observed as a result of someone's trauma? How do you choose to address them or journey alongside that individual to help them cultivate a healthier spiritual message?
In my experience, I have heard the casual, the repetitive, not all blank. So that might be not all men is the number one response. But for the work I do around racial trauma, and when I'm going into these spaces where I'm the educator, the expert that's talking about Blackness and Black things, it's been like not all white people or not all white Christians. I choose to interrogate that claim, the not all, of course, because of course not all, right? But I also validate people's experiences. So the not all I feel is a way to gaslight and to invalidate someone's feelings, someone's thoughts, someone's response to the trauma that they've experienced. So instead of leaning into the not all, I lean into the but there are some, but there are some. So yeah, I validate that experience, even looking into the mirror at myself, like when I experienced the racial trauma at the school, I surrounded myself with white Christians who I knew loved me and cared for me and were deeply concerned about my well-being, because I knew that it wasn't not all, but there were people who were determined to have me believe that the barriers around Christianity was so, and that whiteness created and maintained that boundary. But yeah, so the not all, the gaslighting, and redirecting that and validating people's feelings and doing so, not necessarily in a spiritual way, but because I'm a spiritual person, I'm coming to it with my faith in the forefront. So yeah.
Thank you. Gaslighting is one of the most evil things I see in this world when we talk about trauma. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your truth, Jocelyn.
I think, Teresa, to your point and Jocelyn's point as well, I think gaslighting is the crux of spiritual trauma and where it hinges. And that hinge point is essentially othering people's experience and lived realities and saying that it either is not reality or it is inherently sinful, I think. And that's where you get into the spiritual realm of it, which sometimes can almost be worse. Of like, not only did this not happen to you, not only is your identity invalid, but also there's something intrinsically wrong with you. There's something disordered about who you are as a person. So within my context, that looks a lot like theology, and I will stay in my lane in terms of American Christian theology that would support a non-affirming viewpoint. So when I talk about non-affirming and affirming, I'm talking about non-affirming being not in support of same-sex marriage in terms of gender confirming surgeries for trans and gender expansive people, for ordination, limiting the ability for queer people to exist within church life. So when we posit as a theological framework that there is something inherently other about queer individuals or any other kind of minority population within a church and congregational context, it's really easy to then vilify people, and then that translates into people's minds as God doesn't love me, I'm unlovable, there's something wrong with me, and there's possibly nothing I can do about it, which I think also probably lends to the pretty horrifying self-harm and suicide statistics that we see within queer individuals. So as a whole, the Trevor Project has found that religion and spirituality can be a protective factor. Where it breaks down is for queer youth. You can see that it actually stops being a protective factor and it actually works in the opposite. So it's a double-edged sword in a lot of ways, in the way in which spirituality can be so beneficial, but then it can also be so deeply harmful. So, and it can be holding both of those things in tension for some people as well. But the most common, to circle back to the question, sort of limiting spiritual messages I hear is just, that there's something wrong with them and that there's nothing they can do about it. So the way in which we combat that is either theologically trying to reorient their hermeneutical framework to say, you can think and interpret these passages differently, or conversely, and this is often more what is helpful for people, is just putting them in a community of people who love them and say, like, there's nothing wrong with you. You don't have to be anything else other than who you are. And honestly, the theology kind of comes secondarily and they're less worried about it.
Thank you, Lauren. Community is very important for all people. Thank you for providing that space for people.
Thank you so much for the things that have been said already. It's interesting when I think about the trauma response and also the limiting factors that many people are experiencing right now. And the spiritual messages are that you don't trust, that people are not trusting themselves in their own response, and that many religious messages have been told over their lifetime not to do so, and to stay within a box of belief that has been told to you as a woman, as a child, as a person who might have identified as somebody who was LGBTQ+, that you are not to trust your experience, and that other people are to tell you who you are instead of believing in that identity of yourself as a person who's always in process and who's always changing. And so when I think about trauma itself, not just of spirituality, but of trauma that you experience in your life, is that you're not even trusting what you think about yourself, but you're not even trusting what your body is telling you. And your body is telling you, I am not safe here. So to create a community where you can be surrounded by people who love you, like Jocelyn was saying, and that Lauren is trying to provide in this large community online, that to be able to be accepted for who you are is a foundation for just being able to be together in community. And that takes sometimes a lifetime of unlearning old responses and trying to take on new ones. So I think the spiritual resources we bring to that is just love of ourselves, trusting ourselves, and learning slowly to love each other and to be with each other. It's hard.
Thank you, Christina.
Yeah, so like my fellow panelists, we all carry these same themes into clinical spaces with us. Just because crisis arises doesn't mean that we get to shed everything else that's going on and attend just to that moment. So I'm seeing the similar kinds of things. The gaslighting is particularly evil. Spiritual bypassing tends to be huge in clinical spaces. Our toxic positivity. Let's just look on the bright side. Let's just simply have faith and pray that things will get better, despite medical intervention not being a possibility or even a reality. And then there's significant mental health challenges. Those who are clinically diagnosed with a condition and seeking treatment, or maybe not being treated for. And then just the general malaise and depression. We just went through a terrible year of social isolation and breakdown, and life keeps going. We don't really get a chance to recover from that effectively if we don't carve out time ourselves. And unfortunately, in clinical spaces, that's not the time to do that kind of work because you have more acute needs. So how these things are being addressed, in my situation, witnessing stories is my biggest power. Just being able to walk into a room or an ICU space or the ED and believe survivors and say, no, you are not broken. No, you are not discardable. You are valuable. You have inherent worth, and you are called to do what it is that you are called to do. So a lot of my work as affirmation is pushing back against rigid structures and systems that refuse to look at the facts. Sometimes it's difficult conversations about life and death. Other times it's working with nurses and doctors with compassion fatigue and burnouts, which is a very real thing in these moments. And sometimes that looks like doing art together. Sometimes it looks like just yelling and screaming, or using essential oils and masks to kind of bring you an olfactory sense and kind of break you out of that trauma loop. And sometimes it's just throwing your hands up and breathing deeply and wondering if this ever will come to an end, but trusting that we can keep going together.
Thank you, Eric. I feel that everybody in the medical field right now is just such a rock star right now with everything that's happening. But thank you all. The next question I have is also lengthy, so again, I don't mind repeating the question. How has your theology or spirituality changed as you grow more trauma informed? Has it changed? And has working in the field of trauma and spirituality changed how you approach sacred texts or view other religious themes?
I think this is a great question, and let me know if I'm entirely out in left field and just reel me on back. But I think for myself, viewing individuals through a trauma-informed lens, through a culturally responsive care lens, has been beneficial for me, both from a spirituality perspective and from a professional perspective. I think I occupy kind of a unique space in the sense that we provide spiritual resources and act as spiritual leaders and mentors to individuals whom their greatest trauma may have been from spiritual leaders and mentors. So there's a lot of different trigger points that we have to watch for, especially in our language, in the way in which we are transparent and authentic with our community, to make sure that we are not re-traumatizing an audience who has been through so much already with faith and just their own journey with it, which may have been, since they were little kids. Honestly, this may be a multi-decade process for them. So on a personal level, knowing that any kind of hostility or really deep visceral reaction is probably rooted out of that trauma, and I just may be happening to be stepping in it at that time frame. It's not about me, I think, is what it's really taught me. It's not about me, but it is about what can I do to help this individual, and how do I bring them to a place in which they feel safe and affirmed. So on a professional level, that's been beneficial. From a theological perspective, there's no easy answers, right? I think there's a lot of theological frameworks that want to give you like deep existential answers to hard questions and a lot of like concretes. And the panel itself, it's making meaning in the chaos, right? Like, so much of it is recognizing that I don't have an answer for why bad things happen to people, and that's okay. And it's a better response to individuals to say, I don't know, than to try to give them a platitude or a sermon that just kind of glosses over their pain and their trauma, and to sit in their pain and to sit in my own pain and my own hurt, rather than trying to glaze over it with a very simple theological framework, if that makes sense. So I think it's definitely, in terms of working in this field of trauma and spirituality, made me appreciate approaching the Old Testament within my own faith tradition differently, and really appreciating it, of better resonating with Lamentations, Job, or like the existential poetic waxing of Ecclesiastes. But yeah, I think it also really reminded me that there is, in the Saint Teresa of Avila sense, like, no, Christ has no body on earth but yours, has no hands but yours, and ultimately it is my responsibility as a person of faith to be the love and the light and the affirmation that some people may have never experienced before.
That was not left field at all. Thank you. I'm so glad this is recorded. But that was thank you so much, Lauren.
That puts a lot of thoughts in my mind, Lauren. Thank you for that. Coming from a religious perspective of my own as a Unitarian Universalist, I grew up, UU, to call it a shorter name because it's so long, looking at theology and spirituality and religion like anthropology, in the sense that we all have asked from our own childhood, and we see in all children of all times, those religious questions of, why are we here? Who are we? How am I to relate to you in a way that is meaningful in my life? And what happens to me when I die? And then the religious response of most religious traditions has timelessly been how to be the most loving person you can be in response to the world and the experiences you're having. And so in this world of chaos and tumult that we're experiencing, I keep trying to ask people who I'm speaking with or communities I'm working with just to come back to those core understandings, that our response of loving, being the most loving person we can, sometimes is starting with yourself. When you're feeling that you have been told and experienced in your life that you were not valuable and you were not able to be understood for who you were, that we start with ourselves. So the spiritual leanings that I bring to them is then to ask, where have you ever felt safe? With whom? By what book? By what music? By what practice with your hands, if it's doing prayer beads or things. And sometimes it is moving into a book of Zen poetry, or sometimes it's art therapy. Sometimes it's just simply being with others and breathing, like yoga brings to each other. So helping people realize that the world has a plethora and such a wide variety of opportunities for us to find ourselves again in chaos, might be allowing them to realize that there are many spiritual traditions that can offer that. And it's okay if you participate and borrow and look at and find strength in different things, and that you are always in process, and that spirituality itself is the largeness of the human experience. And we don't have to only be in the box that we started out of. We can also look to what we're called to, and that there are people out there to love you in all different places.
Simply being with others and breathing. I love that. Thank you, Christina.
Yeah, for me, my kind of view of scripture and spirituality has been expanded, deepened. I thought I understood trauma pretty well and knew what it was, and then I began doing my own work and realized that I'm barely scratching the surface. And then I walked into a setting where trauma surrounds every inch of our space and realized, oh, we're drowning. This is way bigger than we can ever conceptualize. So for me, when I look at scripture and look at biblical text, there's a link that Gretchen shared with everybody in the chat, the religious power and control wheel. This is from a marriage and family therapist, Laura Anderson. And she's kind of taken the power and control wheel that Duluth model created back in the 70s and overlaid some religious themes about spiritual and various forms of abuses that we commit with scripture or with religion. Fundamentally, the way that I break it down is I like what Jennifer Baldwin says in her book, Trauma Sensitive Theology. Ultimately, sin, and I struggle with that word in the clinical setting because it carries so much baggage, but I'll use it in this space. Sin is the abuse of relational power. So any system that puts one person over the next, or subjugates, or limits, or invalidates, or whatever that may be, is sin, is separation. And the way that we get through that, the way that I navigate those waters is to be honest with our text. If we don't look at our text for what they are and share the really bad stories, the stories of rape, the stories of adultery, the stories of homophobia, and anything else you can imagine, economic and systemic oppression, and tell them the way they are written and who they are for, if we whitewash those, then we're doing no good with our faith structures. So the first thing we have to do is be honest about the text itself and read it in the context it was written. And then secondly, as theologians, we're called to be on the boundary. We're called to be in those liminal spaces with the people who are suffering. So if you look around and find yourself reading a text and everybody's shaking their head nodding and you have nobody pushing against you, or you don't feel any stirring in your soul, then you're probably not reading it correctly, as a professor of mine once lovingly told us. You don't understand it. You need to go back and read it again, because you can't explain away and hide the bad stuff just because it's stuff you don't want to face.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have leaned more into my Blackness and my womanhood as a result of my spiritual trauma and watching those around me go through those things. So whereas before 5 years ago, perhaps, I would have referred to God as with male pronouns, I've so much so expanded my understanding of the divine ever since I experienced those things. So I've leaned into I've leaned into that. Kind of going back to the question about the harmful messages, there are folks who might hope that I identify as Christian or I identify as Black. But the way God made me, before I chose, I'll put it chose in quotes, before I chose Christianity or chose Jesus, I was Black in the womb. So my spirituality and my race, my culture go hand in hand for me. So my theology has absolutely changed in the past couple of years, ever since I've been aware of the trauma. So perhaps in it I didn't know, but now that I'm fully aware of it and have been aware of it, I can see how things have changed. After the summer after the thing happened, or the summer after the thing happened with the church, and we can talk about that offline if people want to know more about it. But after the thing happened with the church, I started to go into reading books about race and racism, about reconciliation, those types of things, and got into surrounded myself with some more knowledgeable voices, and those kind of became my sacred texts. Not kind of became my sacred texts, those became my sacred texts. So whereas there are books and theologians and material out there that can help us to navigate going through these experiences, though the Bible is not secondary. I would never say that. The Bible is primary source for me as a Christian. I also add to those sacred texts things like hymnals and things like womanist theologian groundbreaking, like pioneering texts like Sisters in the Wilderness, things like that. A womanist reader, which contains a swath of essays. But yeah, working in the field, I differ from everyone else on the panel in that I am self-employed and I, lead worship and I do these workshops and clinics and panels and things like this. But I come up not against, but I'm in conversation with and in community with people who are experiencing this types of trauma, and folks always want to talk about things that have happened in my life where I've bumped up against these things. But yeah, so I don't know that I'm answering the question fully, but yes,
You're doing good.
my theology has changed as a result of my working in with spirituality and trauma, and I'm just grateful that I get to walk alongside students, those who I experienced when I was working for Baylor in the chapel program, and folks who are still with me even today, getting to walk with them through life and to talk about these things and how being a Black Christian informs how they view things. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. How would you suggest other organizations or individuals collaborate with your place of work?
Currently, in my role as a minister of a particular congregation, certainly I want to serve the community in which I live in. But the denomination that I am a part of, Unitarian Universalism, has a goal of being partners with other people in the world, in their communities, in the country in which they live as a whole, is how can we walk alongside you to achieve the goals of justice and equity and a more loving community in which we are a part of. So if you are ever seeking a way to find partners in your work, I hope that you find the communities in which I'm a part of to be able to be your partners. I think that there are many places in our communities, and I'll just speak specifically about the United States, of which I am most common with in my upbringing. There are very few parts of our community world where we can practice being better people and more loving people. We have schools, we have our places of work, we have our book clubs, we have our social groups. But to find a community where we are asking really big questions about who we are and who we want to be and how we can be more loving in the world is also working for justice and equity in the community at large. And so I hope that if you ever need a partner in that work, that you can seek out religious leaders that support that work, and that I could be there for you.
Thank you.
With me, I hope that none of you collaborate directly with my place of work, because that would mean you're in the hospital. And that's not a place that I want to see any of you frequent if you don't have to be there. I'm appreciative of those spaces. But as a chaplain, I get to work with community spaces, leaders like Christina and Jocelyn and Lauren, to be on panels like this, and really what I would love to see or see conversation around is more discussion about the trauma connection with the body. If you haven't read van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, order a copy right now and look at that, because it's groundbreaking. It's stuff that we've known for years but was finally articulated, unfortunately, by a male who was borrowing or stealing feminist feminist work that didn't get the credit it needed. But van der Kolk kind of took it to the larger group. The second thing is practice the daily habits. There's a final link that Gretchen will throw up there about tiny habits. This is from the Trauma Institute, and it's just little things you can do each day to build resilience. take a walk, take time outs, protect mornings, protect that valuable personal time and experience, so that when you do face crisis, you can draw from something, and you've had some practice in these smaller things, even though they may still feel really huge. And finally, engage with arts and poetry. A Windows Between Worlds is one of the groups that I'm a facilitator for. It's an art healing therapy program. So we deal with trauma through art creation. There's a flyer you can look at. I would love to come and do a workshop or talk to you more about that. Or you can get certified yourself and do these workshops to help people who have been through trauma in their own lives and express that in a pre-verbal kind of creative, connective way with others.
Thank you. Jocelyn?
Yes. I went back to look. I'm sorry. Yes. So the way that people could collaborate with my place of work. Again, I'm a self-employed minister. So I think people could do what I'm doing, in that we could be more thoughtful about the words and the music that we use when we're in our worship spaces, and even not outside of our worship spaces. So just being mindful of how history and how Christianity and how other forms of faith have oppressed BIPOC folks, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So steering away from language that is limiting or oppressive. So I don't sing white as snow songs or things like that. You know, it's a little dirty for me. But yeah, so I suggest that people just be mindful of the songs that they're lifting up, the things that the messages that they're sending through the music that we're using. Also to be mindful of the folks who wrote the music, to be thoughtful about selecting repertoire and selecting music written by folks who are outside of our spheres or contexts of influence. So moving beyond the white evangelical only music that pervades our worship spaces, and not just so moving beyond that. So my suggestion in collaborating with me necessarily is to do the things that I'm doing as a worship leader, as a clinician, to seek out other music, to seek out other texts, to seek out other books.
Thank you.
Teresa, I've dropped a few links in there for you to drop into the broader chat if you can, but one of those links is the link to our organization, so qchristian.org. So if you have clients or congregants who really need to reconcile their Christian upbringing or their Christian faith, past or present, with their sexual orientation or gender identity, we have a variety of different resources and support groups, from individuals who are fully, affirming of themselves, to individuals who are really just starting that journey for themselves, and starting that journey with their families more often. So I also have a couple other resources in there too: Unchanged Movement and the Good Fruit Project, both of which are addressing conversion and therapy initiatives. The Good Fruit Project is actually a joint endeavor that we did with the Trevor Project to create a Christian case against conversion therapy. So their 50 Bills, 50 States initiatives is the legislative and policy side, while this is the theology side of it, because you can't legislate away a variety of conversion and change therapy initiatives, both at a clinical and a ministry level. So this is really the attempt to help persuade people, change hearts and minds where legislation cannot. So an Unchanged movement, as well as a collection of stories. If you have anybody you know who is also really trying to maneuver out of a conversion therapy environment, or is really trying to make that reconciling within themselves. It's a compilation of about 115 different queer LGBTQ Christians who have walked that journey and come out as healthier and more spiritually whole people. So there's a variety of resources in there, especially on the Q Christian website. Under the resources tab, you have family crisis and external resources as well that are both religious and secular. So I would encourage you to point people in that direction and peruse yourself if you feel so inclined.
Thank you, Lauren. They are in the chat now. And who designed the Unchanged movement?
That was me. I was being a little bit of a troll, I'm going to be honest. There is a specific ex-gay ministry that's actually pretty large out of California. We've seen a huge resurgence in the ex-gay movement even after Exodus International, for y'all who don't have any framework for it, was the largest ex-gay organization in the world in the 90s. And that closed down after the executive director said that queer identities could not be changed. So there's been a larger movement to reinstate and protect the religious liberties of individuals and clinicians who are performing change therapies on their clients. And so we might have replicated their website somewhat. So individuals who are looking for their website end up accidentally ending up on ours. But it was just a Squarespace template, so figured it might as well be similar in branding, if you will.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you guys all for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. Before we go into the questions, Jocelyn is going to sing for us. I am going to mute myself and also take myself off of camera because I find myself distracting when I'm listening to somebody sing and I'm watching my face on this. So I'm going to be off camera for a minute, but I will come back and we will start with the questions.
Thank you, Teresa. Now that I'm thinking about it, there are questions, and maybe I should do it after the questions, but it's a benediction type of song, but I'll offer it here, and then I'll run it back at the end, maybe. Okay. So this song is One More Day. This is a song by a woman named Dr. Margaret Pleasant Dureau. She's out of California. She was a lifelong music educator and a music minister in her church. She's still living. I said was, but she's still with us. And this song is One More Day. One more day. One more day. I thank God just for one more day, one more day. The Lord has made a way. I thank God just for one more day. Oh, one more day. One more day. I thank God just for one more day. One more day. The Lord has made a way. I thank God just for one more day. Oh, one more chance. One more chance. I thank God just for one more chance, one more chance to do the best I can. I thank God just for one more chance. Thank you, God, for one more chance. One more chance. I thank you, God, just for one more chance. One more chance to do the best I can. I thank God just for one more chance.
Thank you all so much for that, because that was incredible. And Jocelyn, thank you for the song. That was beautiful. Teresa told me that we might get to hear a little bit of your talents. So I'm so grateful for that. I guess to give you a little bit about my spiritual background, I came from a Southern Baptist home, and I'm not particularly religious now in terms of Christianity, but I do appreciate, obviously, spirituality, and that everyone's spirituality is different. So I don't necessarily have the best background in terms of finding chaplains and developing a chaplaincy program. So I'm very thankful for Teresa and for Amanda Cooper, who's also on this call. She's our STC director. She helped me find Teresa and helped kind of create this program. And so I'm super appreciative of that. But beyond having Teresa on staff and being open to different types of spirituality and different beliefs, I'm curious what the panel thinks that Foothills can do for not just our clients, but for our staff, and how we, and particularly I, can support them in what is no doubt a challenging time all around. So do you guys have any advice for us about how we can offer that support?
I'll jump in. I guess one thing that's really important, especially jumping off of what Jocelyn was saying about language and being very careful about the language that we choose, that we are careful about our pronouns. We're careful about the sources of which the sense of truth with a capital T comes from, rather than it being one that's personal and comes from your own lived experience. Being aware of the words that we use that involve power with regards to even issues around raciality and color. But also, I think it's really important that the language about God itself is also one that needs to be open for people who come from a perspective of being agnostic or atheist, that they're living in a secular world in which the same pervasive ideas about love and acceptance and trust is there, and that for them, entering into God language might be going back to a trauma of their own issues of power. So if we could focus on how it is that we relate to each other and what our goals are, and rather than it being religious language that's based in the Western context of God, that we might also open that up to a more ecumenical space for the people that you work with and the staff that you're supporting.
Thank you, Christina.
I think a lot in terms of policy from an organizational standpoint of having religious sensitivity training and really centering equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts within your hiring processes and within some of the programming that you're offering for your staff, something similar to this, honestly. I believe from an HR perspective, the only two protected populations that require employee accommodations are disability and then religion. So having those different conversations around creating safe and equitable spaces for individuals, be that especially intersectional identities, and knowing that you have a diversity of different perspectives on staff, but having the ability to really dive into other people's spiritual and cultural contexts. I know employers have a tendency to not want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, but it's such a deeply integral part of who your staff and who you're working with are, and you can really learn a lot from those different faith traditions, those different spiritual conversations, for sure.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions for our panelists? You can take yourself off mute to ask the question.
Hey, it's Lucila. I just wanted to thank you all for creating this safe space to have some of these uncomfortable, sometimes conversations, but very much needed. I really appreciate hearing from everyone. Thank you very much for the work you're doing in the community. And thank you, Talisa.
Thank you, Lucila.
Even as a part of the panel, I have a question for the other panelists. When I think about the work that we're doing all in our different areas, the things were hard enough already a couple of years ago. The world is changing in multiple ways with regards to climate change, with regards to racial terror, with regards to all these issues that cause us stress and pain in our daily lives. And then we add COVID on top of that. I think for me, the level of stress of not being able to trust the person next to me. If they're not wearing a mask, is it because they're unvaccinated? Or is it because they don't believe in vaccines? How can I know how to be safe for myself and for my children, to be who to be around? I think we're entering into a new way of interacting with the stranger. For me, that's really scary. It brings up a lot of fear and scarcity thinking about, is the world a safe place for me to live in at the moment? And I'm wondering if anyone else experiences that in the work that they're doing, or maybe you just nod your head. But I'm just curious if you're finding that this level of COVID adds a whole new layer of stress and trauma to what we're trying to achieve in the work that we're doing.
I think I'm lucky in that the vast majority of things that I do, I can do from my home. So if I'm recording services or doing a panel like this or leading a workshop, I can do it from my living room, so I don't have to have that added level of stress. But leaving home, and I'll say, because I'm a worship leader, going to church, I told my mother earlier this year, I'm not going to church unless I'm getting paid. And she was like, oh my God, how dare you say something like that? I said, literally, I am putting myself at risk by going into a place with a multitude of people. And to me, it's not worth the risk, especially because we have learned that church can happen if we're considering church a thing that happens instead of us, the people. Church can happen in these virtual spaces, and it's been happening. So yeah, my anxiety is, of course, up when I'm out, but I come to this house by myself all the time, and I'm just so grateful. Thank you, Jesus. I have no one else's germs or any of that stuff in here with me. But yeah, I'm blessed in that I can work from home, do the work I do from home. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say it really exacerbated the mental health concerns within our community, feelings of isolation. So our community groups during COVID grew by 450%. So it shot through the roof because people were just looking to find human connection, and those perhaps dark thoughts that had been there previously are now, on blast and just amplified being in a quarantine space. And even, however you want to consider where we are within the pandemic, still trying to find some level of normalcy at this point. It honestly hasn't really slowed down in terms of people really in virtual spaces trying to find connection and trying to be able to hold their mental health and their physical health in tension and make sure that both of them are being cared for. So we saw a huge influx of individuals who were just trying to get resources and support during COVID. That definitely was a stressor on staff capacity for sure. But I mean, it's a good problem to have in terms of individuals who are finding you and leveraging your resources. But we saw a pretty major influx of people who were looking for help.
Yeah, for me, I kind of resonate with the other panelists, and I see a lot of heads nodding in the participants. The fears of COVID are very real, and I get to see that up close and personal. And it's nothing that I would wish upon anybody to have to go through. But I think Christina asked a really good question about how do we deal with that fear, that specter. And one, I think, is acknowledging our own fears. I don't want to get sick. I do everything that I can to be safe, but I realize I work in a very hostile environment. And two, I have to resist the urge to judge somebody else. Just because I think they're not wearing a mask, they may not believe in the coronavirus. That may not be actually what's going on. Or they didn't get vaccinated, so they don't believe in science, when in reality they could be immunocompromised or could have some kind of condition that won't allow them to be vaccinated. And sadly, it's thinking about our children. I want to get back to worship and get back to community space and get back to all the things that we did before as quickly as possible. But if we're putting children at risk because we want to get back into those spaces as adults, when children can't protect themselves, that's an egregious violation that we have to come to terms with. What's safe? What's safe for my children? How do I keep my fellow neighbor safe? And what's the risk level that we can tolerate? So I don't know how we manage it all except doing our own work and just being gracious and allowing yourself to go scream into a pillow or whatever it is you need to do to de-stress or to get it out, and be gentle with yourself during this time, because we're all experiencing trauma, and unfortunately a lot have more trauma than others, but often don't get to tell us and don't get to share that unless we stop and listen.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a quick question specific to our organization as well. As we deal as a counselor dealing with a lot of children or adolescents or adults, how do you think we can best address the issue of purity culture and the idea of this term swimming in sexual shame? We see sexual shame as sexual abuse, but a lot of people, especially those inside of the purity culture, see it as sexual purity. We have these concepts, especially here in South Carolina, that sex outside of the heteronormative idea of marriage is sexual shame regardless of what it was. So we have sexual abuse and assault and rape in one category, and then just sex outside of marriage, and they seem to merge inside of the purity culture. So do you guys have any advice as we're talking with, like I said, children and adolescents especially, but also adults struggling with this, on how to tackle such a large subject?
That's a really good question, Jenny. I want to jump on that just for a second before other panelists respond. For myself, like I grew up out of purity culture. That's like all that language is super familiar to me. And I'm going to show my hand a little bit and say that I think purity culture is very harmful for people, no matter where you are. And the research shows that as well. And so I have started reading material and also suggesting reading material to other people to combat that and also to open up that conversation. I realize in South Carolina that culturally, purity culture is very much thriving here. And so I try to walk this delicate balance of challenging some of those beliefs, but also not so much that I am totally wrecking somebody's theology, because that to me is also harmful if I'm wrecking that person's theology. Hopefully I'm leading them in a direction, not leading them in a direction. Hopefully I can allow room for so much space of safety and curiosity that person can come to those conclusions themselves. I'm not telling them that is wrong. But if people want resources for that, I can direct you in that direction. But I want to hear what other panelists have to say also. It's a great question.
Thank you. I'll jump in again. I was trying to leave space to see if anyone else jumped in since I spoke first before. My mind is kind of swimming with the information that I come to as a person who's trained as a comprehensive sexuality educator with a set of curriculum called Our Whole Lives. And this was put together by the Unitarian Universalist Association and also the United Church of Christ. And the perspective of being a religious organization that supports and upholds the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and also their need to be connected to other people, allows for sexuality to be something that is lifelong, that starts with the intimate bonds between a mother and a child and nursing and being held and the parents giving skin contact to that baby, that you're teaching that child to trust themselves and to seek care and nurturance by the connections between them and another person physically. And that goes all the way through the sexual life of being a young adult and an older adult, and even to the end of life where we just need to be close to each other. And so by being a part of a religious organization that teaches that sexuality is normal and good and seeking the most primal, loving ways of being together, it's a theological response for me as a person who is a part of providing that space for our children and our young people in our communities to say, let's look openly at what sexuality offers to teach us. And so it's so different than what you were describing as so prevalent, Jenny, and the area in which you're working. And I hope that if there's ever a need for this curriculum to be available, I have taught it as a religious leader and as a religious educator within a religious setting, but I've also used the curriculum taking out any religious language in communities in which I lived in Houston, Texas. And I taught that through Planned Parenthood, and even the YWCA was able to put out that for the community. And so there are places in which you can provide that type of education, and also that the parents are the primary sexuality educators is a message that needs to be taught and supported in the community. That if we look at things from a lens of what's the most loving thing we can do, and how can we provide a space for our children to find love for themselves and love for others, we will open the door for all sorts of ways for the world to be a better place. So if you ever need resources about curriculum, be it that the one that I'm a part of or others that are within that spectrum, please know that you can call me and I can direct you towards it.
as a former UCC minister, I'll echo Christina's recommendation. The Our Whole Lives project is phenomenal. If you don't know about that, reach out to Christina or reach out to, there's website information. It's truly wonderful to teach a comprehensive education about our bodies. And I would love to see more conversation in religious spaces and communal spaces about embodied theology. You know, if we're going to believe survivors and we say that trauma gets stuck in the body, then we have to talk about what is the body created for. And that's not just to get us around and to feed it and go to sleep. It's to enjoy our physical pleasures, to enjoy coffee or bourbon or sex. And those aren't bad things in moderation and done in proper ways. So I would love to see a revolution from my religious counterpoints, you know, to talk about what does it mean to have bodies that were created good, as the Christian texts tell us. What does that mean? If my body is good, then is it good only when I'm doing this, or is it good only when the dominant person saying to be pure is to be heterosexual, or to be in a non-racialized situation? You know, if it's good, it's good. And we need more messages about body image, body positivity, and just physicality and what that means. You know, if you're a Christian, Jesus was a human, had a physical body. Those bodies had urges and had the same requirements that we have. And what does that mean if we talked about that in a space where we kind of desacramentalized some of these functions and just said, hey, we have these wonderful creations that get us through life, and how can we use that in a way to build people up and not traumatize them or shame them or stigmatize them because they may not look or feel or love the same way that I do.
Yeah, I think deconstructing purity culture could be its own webinar, like by itself. I think the difficulty, I'll speak from my own experience, is that individuals deeply steeped in purity culture are going to be informed that the only individuals who can speak to them about their own sexuality are other Christians. So in a clinical setting, what you might run into is an individual, if they are not very far along in their deconstruction process, you can give them stats, you can give them statistics, you can give them all of the analogies you want to, and they're going to be like, yeah, but the Bible says this. Whether or not it actually says that is probably inconsequential to them, but I think that's where the role of clergy is really important in being able to lay that foundation of deconstructing purity culture in a context that is familiar to them, especially if they already have the stigma that mental health providers are trying to lead them astray, which is a common refrain within evangelicalism, is that counseling is a pseudoscience, which we know is not true, but for a lot of individuals, that may be the case. So even in trying to kind of back people up to just like, these are your bodies, and like, it's okay to have these urges, it's okay to live outside of heteronormativity, they may still have a lot of hangups from a theological standpoint and trying to even get to a perspective of like, oh, my body's even my own. It's not owned by a deity that is instructing me in every single thing that I do on a day-to-day basis. So it's complicated, but I think both clinicians and clergy have a role in trying to move people into a healthier sexuality and sexual ethic that works for them.